So a long-awaited Quentin Tarantino film is back, and for one time we all got together and saw it together, which is exciting. We get to go to the film theater together.
On 35mm, no less.
35mm at Film House. It's currently playing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is playing at the Film House and Cameo on 35mm, so that's super exciting. Luca, tell me a little bit about what the film's all about.
So as Paul mentioned, this is Tarantino's 9th and allegedly penultimate film. So I think he's got one more to go before he reaches his 10th mark.
Also, just bone of contention, is not his 9th film. It's his 10th film. Kill Bill was 2 films. I don't care what Quentin Tarantino says.
2 films, 2 tickets, right? So the film is set in the late 1960s, sort of at a point of transition in Hollywood between old and new. And it follows Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, who is an actor, and his best buddy / stuntman / gopher, Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt, whilst in Tarantino fashion, simultaneously following Sharon Tate and her gallivanting around Hollywood, and then sort of counting down to the Manson murders. I have had an interesting relationship with Quentin. He is a filmmaker that, for a lot of people, particularly my age, and I assume with you guys as well, you watch him, you learn a lot about his films, and you learn a lot about other films, but you eventually you get tired of QT. And this is pretty much his masturbatory playground of references and vinyl records and everything. There is this film, it's everything QT, and that's going to put off a lot of people. But I liked it, especially in comparison to After the Hateful Eight, which was, upon reflection, a bit of a slog.
So I think Lucas kind of hit the nail on the head there in terms of it being, packed full of references, and I don't think you could possibly be in any doubt that Quentin Tarantino made this film. Yes, maybe the dialogue's a little less kind of snappy and quippy and witty than it was in his early work, but it's very much a Quentin Tarantino film. For me, it didn't really work quite as well. Now, I've been a big fan of Quentin Tarantino, and I think his initial run of 3 films, so Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown also, I kind of credit that with getting me into film, to be perfectly honest, or at least thinking about it as something beyond, something to pass the time. Since then, I've had a bit more of a mixed reaction to it, and I think he does collapse into self-indulgence very easily. Now, sometimes it works, because certainly Pulp Fiction is like that, and there are other films where that works. For me, it worked in Django Unchained. It also worked for me in The Hateful Eight. I really liked The Hateful Eight. But there are also films where it really doesn't. And the thing it reminds me the most of is actually Kill Bill Volume 1, which was very packed with references of East Asian action films, anime, and all these things that he loved. And whilst it's quite good to see that passion on screen, for me, this was basically the equivalent, but for old Hollywood. And there's plenty to like about the film, which I'm sure we're going to go talk about shortly. But for me, it was just too meandering, and that's not to do with the length, crucially, because as his films go, it's actually kind of a standard sort of length for his films. But for me, it was very meandering, and it didn't really coalesce into something which I think would resonate beyond people who also share that level of passion that Tarantino does. It didn't quite come together for me, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I heard this film was fantastic and amazing, and at Cannes it was, really, really lauded, and the performances. And I was not expecting the film to kind of be so quiet. There's some sort of quietness to it, or like you said, meandering. And but I also think it is very much a love letter to LA, and it kind of fits within those genres of films like The Player, the Robert Altman film, and just about old Hollywood. And there is something really lovely about the way everything was shot, and that the performances, and certainly you could see these actors, Quentin Tarantino and as well as Quentin Tarantino. And the two actors, I think Leonardo is a little bit younger, but they're dealing with that kind of sort of age frame where they were really, really big things, a few years ago, and now they're coming into that kind of thing. So I think they were probably very method in the way that they respond, and it came across really, really, really wonderful for me. So I did enjoy it. I just didn't think maybe it was as funny as I expected it to be. Maybe a little bit more melancholic, and was slightly a different tone. But then while I sat through it, I quite loved it.
So yeah, it's very much Tarantino lamenting the passing of an age. Now, without kind of going into the trajectory the plot takes with like the Mansons, who are, it's interesting that the film got, when it was initially in development, there was a lot of talk about, Tarantino's making a film about the Manson murders. This is very much not about the Manson murders. It's using the Manson murders as a signpost, a waypoint, a milestone in the history of Hollywood to signify the passing of an age. He has very much used it to hang this fondness and nostalgia for old Hollywood upon it. And the two characters that we follow, Cliff Booth and Rick Dalton, so Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio respectively, I think you've also got it correct there in that they are dealing with, are they relics, are they dinosaurs, and is the industry and like culture in general moving on from them? There is a little bit of meta-ness to that, particularly when you think about the way Tarantino himself has been regarded in recent years. I mean, certainly in the post-Weinstein world, I think a lot of people are questioning his conduct and behaviour. To me, it is very there's all these different bits to it, but it is too meandering. Now, he's done this with his films before, but they've kind of got an explicit chaptered structure. And I actually think this film would have worked better if he'd done that, because the Rick Dalton storyline, the Cliff Booth storyline, and the Sharon Tate storyline, right, so Margot Robbie is Sharon Tate, they do all intersect. They are all related. I mean, like the conceit is that Rick Dalton lives next door to Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski. But to all intents and purposes, they don't really overlap until the finale of the film. I mean, they intersect at points. It's exactly the same setup that you had in Pulp Fiction. Separate characters, separate storylines, but they link together and coalesce into some sort of climactic finale. It's a similar thing going on here, but it's just too meandering. It's not punchy enough to bring you along with each segue.
I agree. I think the idea of characters finally intersecting at the end, for me, usually, like, if you look at Inglourious Bastards, I think that was a case of characters intersecting, but largely because of plot, because like characters had the same motivation. Here, it is super interesting that, without spoiling anything, the two parties of Sharon Tate, of old and new Hollywood, intersect, but it is interesting to have them be neighbors. And there's a bit at the end that's probably the most melancholic moment after a very specific sequence. That's literally old Hollywood being accepted into the gates of new. At the same time, I think the meandering thing it worked for me in a way that it hasn't for a Tarantino film before, because there's a lot of sequences in this film of actors just lounging around because like in between takes, and like there's an entire extended sequence that's with DiCaprio talking to a girl that I think is based on Jodie Foster. I think Tarantino has said. And for me, this entire film, especially when we get into the final part of it, and the fact that the title is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it is, to me, it's like the pipe dream of an actor in downtime. It's like it's some imagined thing that he sort of conjured up here, and like that for the meandering works in that respect. Because I think DiCaprio said as well, this is like a day or two in the life of these actors.
But that's the thing, right? It's a day or two in the life of these actors. If he had a more disciplined focus, right, I really do think this film could have worked fantastically, right? Because if you take any one of the individual strands, like so the standout scene for me, and this the Manson Ranch, right, the Span movie ranch that they basically lived on. There's a scene where Brad Pitt finds himself at that ranch, right, and it's super tense. It's incredibly well shot, and it's a little bit like that tension that Tarantino brought to a very claustrophobic space in the opening scene of Inglourious Bastards, right, where Hans Landa confronts the French farmer who's, hiding Jews underneath his floorboards. It's like he's taken the tension of that and he somehow extended it to this dusty, yellow lit California landscape, and it's really fantastically done. But the problem is, either side of this, you've got, Leonardo DiCaprio acting, you've got Sharon Tate going to see herself at the cinema, and all these different bits, they all have their own really great bits to them. But it felt like somebody had taken a mini-series and just thrown it, to me, it felt like somebody had taken a mini-series and thrown them all together. I don't really know what he's trying to say by telling these stories simultaneously. And it's this lamenting of an age where he just kind of wants to throw everything on screen. It felt like it was the first or second draft of the script made it up there.
Well, I think, again, I think it goes back to this idea of, like you said, like a new time, like an old time meeting another time. And then right now we're in that maybe phase for him. He's still filming on 35 millimeter and we're moving into the digital era and stuff. And I think this is like a lot of it was pulling stuff about Hollywood today that's still like a part of their lives and reflecting on it and the oldness, the nostalgia that is still what LA is. It's an homage to an old LA, but also a love letter to a city that's still thriving.
To the point as well, as I was talking with Jim, when you look at the casting for the Manson family, you like a lot of them are daughters primarily of famous people. So you have Margaret Qualley,
Right.
who's Annie McDowell's daughter. You have I think Johnny Depp's daughter's in there, Kevin Smith's daughter's in there, and then Ethan Hawke's and Uma Thurman's daughter's there, and they're sort of the villains. They're like they're it's weird. They're new Hollywood, but they're like demonic hippies. I don't know what Quentin is trying to say with that.
Who knows? But it is a Quentin Tarantino film, absolutely. So if you like Quentin Tarantino and you like Hollywood, and if you're a cinephile of sorts, as Luca is, I think this might be your film of the summer.